There is one intellectual and cultural battlefield that hasn't been quiet for centuries, and on which, in this last fifth of the 20th century, the battle does indeed rage, with much waving of new flags. Or rather, the battles rage. There are more than two armies and a good many roving bands, better or worse armed, and a good many individual free spirits seeking to take on all comers. The subject matter is the nature of the human mind, and more particularly, the relation between the mind and the brain. How is some thought you have of me right now, or maybe that urge you feel to turn up the sound on the telly, how does that relate to the 1,500 grams of stuff in your head? Does the brain have thoughts and feelings as a product, maybe as a byproduct? Could it be the truth, rather, that the mind runs the brain? Is neither of those ideas right? It's not puzzling that the battlefield has for a long time been crowded. What's to be won is not just the prize for truth, for solving the puzzle. Philosophies, sciences, and models of the mind are more than just that. They have profound implications. They carry with them a lot of other things that matter. Some carry with them determinism, the proposition that the mind is machine-like, wholly a matter of causal and law-like connections. Perhaps that all mental events are just the effects of physical events in the brain. Such a view has always seemed to threaten not only freedom and responsibility, but our very uniqueness as individuals. Other philosophies and sciences of the mind, which give it more independence of the brain, offer to save not only freedom, responsibility, and individuality, but more than that. Ancient hopes of a religious or a spiritual or a metaphysical kind are to be salvaged from where many say they are, that is, in the dustbin of history. Again, and differently, some accounts of the mind promise us an escape at last from what you might call the boredom of mystery. The mind is brought into accord with relatively clear principles and methods of science. Finally, there's the matter of moral and political implications. It's said that some of the curses of our time, say pornography or terrorism or dehumanization, these are somehow owed to or they go with materialist or naturalist views of the mind, those that give some dominance to the brain. Well, there's no puzzle then about the battlefields never having gone quiet. There's no puzzle either about the renewed vigor on it. That is owed, I think, in one large part to what might be called a first maturing of the neurosciences, neurophysiology, neuroanatomy, neurobiology, neurochemistry, and so on. They bring new weapons to hand. These new weapons, perhaps against expectation, are not seized only by the materialist and the naturalist armies and parties. Professor Sir John Eccles has been one of neurophysiology's leaders for decades and was a winner of the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1963. To his many works on the neuron, the brain, the central nervous system, he's added a philosophy of mind, a joint endeavor with the distinguished philosopher of science, Professor Sir Karl Popper. In this theory, the mind is certainly not prisoner of the brain, nor very certainly is the mind identical with the brain. Our beliefs and our judgments, our hopes and despairs, these aren't just the very same things as physical processes in the brain, say the firing of neurons or the traffic of transmitter substances. There is something called the self-conscious mind, which is above all that. For Sir John, as a religious believer, as I mean to say without any implication, the idea of the self-conscious mind is a pretty satisfying one. Dualist interactionism, as he names his view, is certainly not the only dualist view of mind and brain, but perhaps it's the one which satisfies most aspirations. Professor John Searle is also a man of large distinctions. Having escaped from Oxford a decade or two back and taken up residence in the University of California at Berkeley, he's come to be what you might call a philosopher's philosopher. His signal work on the philosophy of language, above all on speech acts, has now had added to it comparable achievements in the philosophy of mind. And he is this year's BBC Reith Lecturer. Well, Professor Searle does indeed have a different view of the mind and brain, one that is closer than that of Sir John to the inclination of most neuroscientists. It's said that the mind and the brain are one thing, not two. Thus, Professor Searle's view comes with the label monist interactionism. It's not, I think, such a view as to satisfy Sir John's deep hopes. Sir John, we shall come to your arguments and perhaps your hopes, but might we begin with your conclusion? What would you, or how would you state what you take to be the central proposition of your view of mind and brain?
Yes, I've had this more or less developing all through my life from adolescent years, when I have struggled to understand the brain more and more and to see how it could be related to all my mental life. I wanted to see this interaction, and I found out that the brain sciences of the time were quite inadequate to bear it. So I became a brain scientist with Sherrington. I was at Oxford for 12 years working on this, but working more remotely just to understand the working of neural happenings. And from that gradually has come more or less a brain performance, which I feel now is adequate at last to be the servant, I might say, of the master of the mind.
Right.
That I have a brain at my disposal, my brain, which I've never seen.
Sir John, there is one question which I'm sure you can clear up, which is roughly this one. There are a lot of dualistic views of mind and brain,
yes.
And there's one very common one which says that with respect to each of a lot of brain events, there is a corresponding mental event. And that view of the mind stops there. Now, one might think in your view that there are actually three things, not two. That is, there are brain events, and there are mental events, and there is something, a third thing, which is overseeing the lot. Is that a distortion of your view?
Yes. I think correctly, there are a tremendous amount of neural events which have no relation to consciousness at all. Then there are another special class of neural events which are somehow related to the mind and received from the mind. But then on top of that, I believe there is the whole mental world, which I live in and which is related to my brain, interacts with it, but is quite independent from it.
Right. It does begin to sound as if, in your view, each of us is not just a pair, but a triad, that each of us is perhaps not just a duet, but a trio.
Yes, but then I would put, if you like to think of it, it used to be called the mind-body problem, incorrectly, because the body doesn't do anything directly with the mind. It must only receive through the brain and special parts of the brain. That could be your triad, could be mind, brain, body.
Mm-hmm. You describe yourself as a finalist in some of your recent writings, and I think you refer to the fact that you think that the entire history of the universe, that is the evolution of the universe and then the evolution of us, all of that sequence of events is directed to some final end.
Yes.
Is that traditional religious belief?
No, it's an attempt to try to explain how I come to be. Let us be clear about that. I am primarily trying to understand myself. That's my whole lifelong ambition, is to know what I am, who I am, how I am, what I am. This, you might say, is a very restrained position. But I immediately then say, but then if I know what I am, then I can tell you, know much more about you. Only through studying myself can I understand about other people. You see, this is the way I look at it.
I'm sure every man has to put up with his critics, and I'm sure you're able to deal with yours.
Yes.
Some of them would, I suppose, suspect that your religious belief has directed your neuroscience. What would you say to such aggressive persons?
I don't mind if they say it, really. I want them to think of me more as an inquiring philosopher who is trying to understand himself. And of course, I do believe that if you try to understand yourself, you are quickly in the ballpark of religion. Because as I see it now, there are just two big explanatory fields in the world. There's the scientific materialist explanations, and there is the religious one. Mm-hmm. And these two try to explain ourselves. And I think that the scientists have gone beyond their purview to try to take over the religious explanations. And I think they've been guilty of many superstitions in that respect, which is called scientific beliefs.
Mm-hmm. But we shall certainly come back to that. But I would like now to perhaps have an initial statement of his view from Professor Searle, who says above all that the mind and the brain are one thing. I suppose if someone said to me that the brain was the same one thing as the mind, and then I thought that the brain was physical, I might suppose that you were suggesting that the only stuff that exists in the universe is physical. Is that what you mean by saying that the brain and the mind are one thing?
Actually, I think that the word thing here is going to be a source of confusion. The way I think of it is like this. Take this glass of water. The glass of water is entirely made up of, the water itself is entirely made up of H2O molecules. But it's got a lot of properties that are not properties of individual molecules. For example, it's now in a liquid state. Now, the liquidity of the water is caused entirely by the behavior of the molecules, but the liquidity isn't a separate thing. It's just a feature of the system of H2O molecules. You can't say of any molecule, you can't say this one's wet. Now, I take that as an absolutely banal example of a familiar set of relationships in nature, where a higher level feature of a phenomenon is caused by the behavior of the micro elements. It's caused by the behavior at the smaller level, but at the same time, it's just a feature of the system made up of those elements. And it seems to me that's exactly the relation between what we call the mind and the brain. It isn't that there is a thing called the mind, which happens to be identical with another thing called the brain. No, there's just one thing in my skull, and that's my brain. But the brain has certain processes that cause the things that make life interesting, such as consciousness, mental states, intentions, desires, all the rest of it. And those, although caused by processes at the neurophysiological level, are themselves features of the whole system. So just as I can't say of any molecule, this one's wet, so I can't say of any neuron or any synapse, this one's conscious, but consciousness is an emergent property in the utterly banal and non-exciting sense in which liquidity is an emergent property of the H2O molecules.
Right. I do understand your reluctance to suppose that there are two things in your view, because that would bring you somewhere on the way to the position of Sir John Eccles. You do, however, say that there are levels or perhaps features or characteristics. Indeed, presumably you have to, because you talk about the relationship between mental and physical properties or parts, and indeed you talk about one of them causing the other. The physical causes the mental. Well, I understand your reluctance to say there are two things, but presumably we have, in some sense, two entities, or two characters, or two parts, and it might be suggested by an aggressive person, which I'm not, that you are Sir John Eccles under a slight disguise. That is, you two are a dualist.
No, I'm not a... Well, there is a sense in which you could say my position is dualist, because I think that naive mentalism, the view that we really do have conscious mental states and that they make a difference to our life, they're not just epiphenomenal, that is a view that I adhere to. But if I had to summarize the reason why I'm not a dualist, it's this. If you take naive mentalism, the view that we really do have conscious mental states and that our most naive views about the mind, that I'm now conscious and awake and so are you, and you take that and contrast it with naive physicalism, the view that the world consists entirely of physical particles, entirely of microparticles and the various relations between microparticles, those views seem to me to be perfectly consistent. In other words, I want to reject the military metaphor that you began the program with, saying that there are these armies struggling over this great issue. I think, in fact, the issue has a rather easy solution, that the mind-body problem is a bit like the stomach digestion problem, and I want to see it in as banal a terms as those, because I want to say that just as we don't feel there must be a stomach digestion dualism, though, I mean, it's perfectly possible to have a stomach where digestion isn't going on. Similarly, I don't see any need for a mind-brain dualism, though, of course, it's perfectly possible to have brains that aren't alive where no mental processes are going on. So it isn't a question of there being two different things in my skull, but rather there are different levels of description of a set of biological processes. At one level, we can describe it in purely physiological terms of neuron firings and synapses and action potentials and all the rest of it. And at another level, we can describe the very same system as a conscious system engaging in certain kinds of voluntary behavior, having certain sorts of thoughts and feelings. And those descriptions, I want to emphasize, are not in any way in conflict with each other.
Could I just ask you for perhaps a very brief answer to one final question in this initial moment of our discussion? Sir John Eccles allows that there is some connection between his neurophysiology and his religious belief. I suppose it might be asked of you whether you are that kind of person who is deadly against mystery. That is, you are totally opposed to finding mystery in the universe, and are very keen, rightly, on being another kind of person, not a mystery monger, but some might say a plain Californian man. Now,
I think the fact that the world exists and that the way that it exists, that the way in which it works, is a source of astonishment and mystery to me all the time. That is to say, it seems to me a source of immense mystery that a series of neuron firings in my hypothalamus can produce my present feeling of thirst, or that an impact of a lot of photons on my retina together with a bombardment of my lateral geniculate nucleus in the visual cortex can produce all these myriad visual experiences that I have. On the contrary, I stand before nature with awe and mystery. It seems to me that's the original, this is the original Socratic origin of philosophy, is this sense of mystery.
Excellent. Well, Sir John, I wonder what you think of that position.
Well, I am trying to think of myself and my brain. That's been my lifelong problem. And when I consider that and what I know about the brain, I'm not prepared to give it all of these mental properties. I don't see any reason for that. There's no physical basis for this, nothing in physics giving mental properties to complexities of neurons or complexities of any matter in any form whatsoever. And in fact, a large part of the brain is as complex as you can think of without any mental properties. So this has to be explained. How can this come about? Then I wanted to finally say that the evidence from the neurosciences sharpens all of these problems now so that we can say certain areas of the brain, very precisely defined ones, give us special mental happenings, and others are responsible for controlled movements with free will and so on coming in. This is what we now know. So it does seem to me to require some development of your hypothesis.
Well, I think in part I agree with what you said, namely that we don't know an awful lot about the details of the way the brain works, but we do know enough now so that certain sorts of mental features can be localized. But your first point seems to me one that is really quite irrelevant, and that was that the notion of the mental isn't a notion that's part of physics. But there are lots of things in the world that are not part of physics, at least physics narrowly construed, of all sorts of biological processes. I mean, the notion of life itself is not a notion of classical physics. It's a biological notion, but we see life as an emergent property, if you like, or a property of certain sorts of physical systems. Now, in exactly that sense, I want to say that the brain is capable and indeed does produce certain sorts of mental states. And I like your point about localization. I mean, we know that, for example, in case of pains, that certain sorts of neuron firings, picking up stimuli at free nerve endings, passing through the spinal cord and through the with the delta A fibers and the C fibers and into the thalamus and the somatic sensory cortex, you actually have the feeling of pain, and this is produced by certain events in the brain. Now, we don't know how that works except for a very few simple mental phenomena, but there doesn't seem to be any obstacle in principle to getting a complete account of how brain events produce our mental life.
And I think there is.
And what would that be?
I would say, first of all, that biology, you gave us an example of not being in physics. That was the idea of vitalism, that it was beyond physics, and that has been eliminated by science for quite a long time. Biology is completely within the physical world.
And in that sense, I want to say the mind is part of the physical world. But that is, there was a time when there was a big issue between vitalism and mechanism, and now it's just not an issue anymore because we understand the biological processes that are part of life. But we don't describe them in Newtonian terms. I mean, it isn't as if we describe life strictly in terms of Newtonian mechanics. No, we have a biological explanation of what are physical systems. And it's in exactly that sense I want to say we can have a biological explanation of our mental life where we perceive mental features of the world as just higher level physical features of reality. I want to say the opposition between the physical and the mental is just a relic of dualism.